and vary the parameters. But whatever you do, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. So here are the baseline parameters for which I'm going to show you the numbers. The fatality rates conditional on infection for the three groups. I'm going to get them from the table above. The three groups, middle-aged, young, and older, their population shares are from the census. In the baseline, I'm assuming that this doesn't matter at all, actually, or not much. I'm assuming that the 65 plus are fully retired. In practice, 80% of them are retired. And the wages of young and middle-aged in the data are very close, so we take them to be one, normalized to be one. The essential workers are supposed to be 30% of the relevant age groups, and we take theta j to be 0.75, which means that if I lock down 4 people, it's like one of them is sneaking out and continuing to infect. So that seems to be fairly realistic, given that even with infection, and then I'll talk about this when you do, for example, group social distancing in nursing homes, I'll come back to that. So in the baseline, unfortunately, as in the US and not like as in Germany, we're assuming that the probabilities of detection and isolation are 0, and the probability of identifying recovered individuals, I take that to be 100%, but that doesn't really matter too much. Gamma J is 1/18, which means essentially 18 days length of infection. And we take the beta and rho ij parameters so that the R0 is 3.5 in the baseline. That's a little high, and then we've done it with the lower ones as well. It matters for the numbers, of course, but for the qualitative patterns that we emphasize, it doesn't matter. The reason why we start with a high level, the next version we're going to go lower, is because we wanted to be conservative in every respect. And that also, not make the model be too aggressive in terms of, let's go for the economic recovery. And then that's also colors our next bullet point, that we take the death probability to be highly sensitive to ICU overcapacity. So if the ICU overcapacity is exceeded by several folds, then the death rate of people who are in the ICU need state increases 5 times. Again, that might be a little too aggressive. When you reduce that, the death rates reduce a little bit, but those are the baseline parameters. Okay, without further ado, here is what you get with optimal uniform lockdown policy. I'll compare this later to what happens if you don't do any policy in a second. But a couple of things. First of all, the optimal lockdown policy starts locking down people, more than half of the people, not all the way to the 70%, which is the allowable maximum, and then keeps these lockdowns in a gradually reduced fashion for about a year and 2 months. So it's a very, very long lockdown. Despite that, the thing I should have said is the one important parameter that I didn't put on this slide, and I was going to say it here, and then I forgot. What do you do for which value of life these are? So we take this for chi 20, which means that this non-pecuniary psychic cost of death is 20 times annual income. So putting that together with lost output, that means it's a statistical value of life per year of about 200,000, which is in the ballpark of what is used. Now, I am very skeptical of statistical value, and you get fairly bad outcomes in this case. So in particular, the box at the top right-hand side corner shows you economic loss as a fraction of 1 year's GDP, population fatalities, and fatality rate, and then fatalities by group. So a couple of points. First of all, unfortunately here, even with the optimal uniform policy reflecting the aggressive assumptions we've made about the nature of the COVID-19, you have 1.8% of the adult population dying. Most of this comes from the older groups, who have a 7% fatality rate. Again, that's because the ICU capacity in the US gets exceeded in these scenarios. But despite that, you don't do very well economically either. There's a 24.3% loss equivalent to 1 year's GDP. About 20% of this comes from the fact that you suffer a current recession, and about 4% or 4.5% of it comes from the fact that you're losing lots of lives and they are not going to contribute for the next 50 years. Now, contrast this with optimal semi-targeted policy. What do I mean by semi-targeted? Only treat the oldest age group differentially. So the figures show what happens when you do that. You have a less strict and shorter lockdown. It stays below 50%, and it's lifted completely in about 7 months. But the oldest group is kept under lockdown throughout until a vaccine comes. That's the most vulnerable group, and you want to reduce their interactions, and their economic contribution is lower, so keeping them under lockdown is less costly. Now you see that the overall mortality halves from 1.8% to about 1%, and the economic loss almost halves from 24+ % to just under 13%. Couple of things to note. First, despite the fact that the older group is locked down, still they account for the majority of the fatalities. Why? Because the lockdowns are imperfect, and that's the nature of the thing. Many of them are in nursing homes, or they're being cared for by their adult children or relatives, so you cannot completely isolate them. So that's captured by our 0.75 parameter value. And that is actually the reason why you still have a fairly severe lockdown in the early stages. You're trying to limit the infection of the younger group, not just to protect the younger group, but to protect the older group, recognizing that they are going to pass it to the older group despite the lockdown. So that's a very important point, and I'll come back to that in a second.
So there's another question concerning, so you take the age dimension, but would you generalize that to any dimension where you say there's a group which is more susceptible than another group?
Absolutely.
And in particular, there's a question, I'm not sure whether it's 100% PC, is we know that women are less susceptible to the virus. So you can also do it across the gender, or is this?
Absolutely. I think ultimately what you want to do is do it by comorbidities and other characteristics. But the nice thing about the older group that it's observable, you have much better data. The comorbidities, it's very different across countries, and it's identifiable. And the older group is also economically more segregated, and there are better ways of doing this kind of targeted policy. That's why we started there. But absolutely, I think those should be considered as well. But I'm going to show you the next figure is actually relevant there. Mm-hmm. So in the next figure, I say rather than do semi-targeted policy, let's do fully targeted policy. And you could do this not just with the young and the middle age, but imagine we have men, women, etc. And the big result here is that, sure, if you allow me as an optimal control applier to treat these two groups differentially, I will treat them differentially, but the gain I get is trivial. So look at the left-hand panel here. And what you see is that now you have a fairly severe lockdown on the middle age and a much less severe on the younger group. But look at the GDP loss. It's again just about 13%. Look at the population fatalities. It's just again about 1%. So there is very little to gain from fully targeted policies once you do the semi-targeting of treating the older group differently. So therefore, if this conclusion generalizes, what I would say is that the big targeting has to be with respect to the comorbidities that are critical. Now, let me sort of amplify that point, and then I'll come back to a couple of other points.
Can I just interject here?
Please, of course.
If you have a situation like in emerging economies or in Italy where different generations live together, how would the model change?
Yes, so I think there's an implementation aspect to it. And even before you go there, the biggest problem is, for example, how do you protect people in nursing homes? And I think that requires lots of different measures. So this is why testing and tracing are going to be very important. If you have testing and tracing, you can do much better job of protecting the older, more vulnerable group from the infections of the people they have to be commingled with. For the nursing home population, that's the nursing home aides and nurses and other people who come into nursing home. For people who are in the same household, you have to do it with different sort of measures, but once we have the testing and tracing, that really amplifies the value of these targeted policies, as I'm going to show in a second. So let me amplify this point by showing you the Pareto Frontiers. So first, you see the red is the Pareto Frontier with optimal policy. The green and the blue are the targeted and the semi-targeted frontiers. You see that they are significantly inside, as the numbers I just showed you indicate, but they're also on top of each other. There really is very little quantitative gain from fully targeted policy once you do the semi-targeted policy. Now, what about the no lockdown? If we were to put the no lockdown here, it would be somewhere here. It's really a very bad outcome because you are exposing or further to the right, you are exposing your population to a lot of fatality, but you're also losing a lot of economic output. Why? Because a lot of people who were going to be productive in the future die now, and their foregone economic contributions make this a bad economic deal as well. So lockdowns are very important, but you have to do them in a targeted way. Now, the next point I want to make is also important. So I want to now show you the same optimal policy, but for a different point along the Pareto Frontier. So when I increase the value of life by another $80,000. And that's the optimal policy. Now, the top one is the uniform and the bottom one is the semi-targeted. Now, I'm going to contrast this now. I'm going to flip back to the slides for 1 second. So this was the optimal uniform policy. You see that in the optimal uniform policy, infections reach 0 before the vaccine arrives. That's herd immunity. So even though we were fairly aggressive in our assumptions, for a value of life of about 200,000 per year, the optimal policy picked some type of herd immunity. That's conceptually good because then we were comparing optimal uniform policy to optimal semi-targeted policy that was also doing herd immunity for the younger group, but of course waiting for the vaccine for the older group. So that was a nice comparison, but it's not necessarily the option that many people want. Many people don't want herd immunity because it involves these high fatality rates. So now if we jack up a little bit, not too much, but a little bit the value of life, then under the optimal policy, you get the herd immunity, you get waiting for vaccine. How do you see that? Well, you see that in two ways. First of all, you see that this 50% lockdown continues almost for 2 years. You start relaxing at the end only because you know the vaccine is coming, and before the infections peak, you're going to be able to get the vaccine to everybody and get everybody immune. And so you see that here also the infections are peaking. That shows that there was no herd immunity. As soon as you let people back in, because there is no herd immunity, infections are going to spike up, but the vaccine is stopping it here. Okay, but
so
now
can I ask you about
just
about
1 second, Marcus.
Sorry.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
About the value of life, I just would like to understand it. If your value of life is based on the annual income and you increase the annual income, let's say by 50%, then the GDP cost would also go up by 50%, or is it just the other component?
No. Sorry. Let me repeat that. So if we go back, this is important.
I know you had two components. I guess you only
we are doing it by increasing the second component. So here we are keeping, this is, of course, everything would be invariant to just increasing WJ. So we're increasing the value of life by increasing the psi j. Even with this greater value of life, the semi-targeted policy does not need to wait for the vaccine for everybody, because you're still keeping the older population locked down. You can do a partial form of herd immunity for the younger population, and you keep the mortality rate lower than before because life is more valuable. And look at the contrast now. Without the herd immunity, the economic costs are even greater. So there were almost 40% of 1 year's GDP decline. So you can reduce that to 15%. And what do you do to population fatalities? Well, because value of life was greater, you had reduced that to 1.2%, but now you can reduce that to essentially 0.09%. So now you see the two faces of the benefits of the semi-targeted policies. They do very well when you are doing the same strategy of herd immunity or same strategy of waiting for a vaccine, but they sometimes enable you to change